Most people do not have a money problem. They have a behavior problem that happens to involve money. And because behavior feels personal, because it feels like identity, it is rarely questioned with the same objectivity people apply to numbers. So the cycle continues quietly and without interruption across years and sometimes entire lifetimes. Money is treated as a mathematical game when in reality it is a psychological one. And that misunderstanding is expensive in ways that compound silently across decades, not immediately, and not in ways that are easy to identify in any single moment, but over time in ways that are quiet enough to go unnoticed and consistent enough to permanently alter financial trajectories. This matters because the people most affected are rarely the ones who lack information. They are the ones who have the information and still cannot make it stick behaviorally. Every financial decision feels rational in the moment it is made. Spending feels justified by context and circumstance. Investing feels timed correctly based on the information currently available. Risk feels calculated and proportionate to the opportunity being considered. But what feels rational in the moment is often just emotion dressed carefully in the language of logic. The purchase is not really about the object being acquired. It is about the relief the acquisition momentarily provides from a discomfort that existed before the purchase and will return shortly after it. The investment is not really about long-term value or carefully assessed fundamentals. It is about the discomfort of watching others participate in something that is visibly and publicly moving upward without you. The risk taken is not really about probability or expected value calculated with clear and dispassionate eyes. It is about the need to feel in control of an outcome in an environment that continuously and structurally resists that control. Money, understood this way, becomes less of a tool and more of a mirror. It reflects fear in the decisions made when markets decline sharply and the future feels genuinely uncertain and threatening. It reflects status in the purchases made when income rises and the social environment is watching closely and drawing conclusions. It reflects insecurity in the positions taken when others appear to be performing better and the comparison becomes difficult to sit with, honestly. It reflects the quiet and largely unconscious need to prove something, often to people who are not paying particularly close attention to begin with. And once this pattern becomes visible, a different and more honest understanding of financial behavior begins to emerge clearly. People do not chase money in any simple or straightforward sense. They chase what they believe money will fix. Security that feels permanently out of reach regardless of how much accumulates. Freedom from obligations and structures that feel constraining and limiting and inescapable. Validation from an external world that seems to measure worth almost entirely through visible accumulation and the markers of financial success. Distance from past experiences of scarcity or instability or financial humiliation they would prefer not to repeat or even remember. These are not trivial motivations, and they are not signs of weakness or irrationality. They are deeply human responses to real experiences that left lasting and powerful impressions on the psychology now driving the financial decisions being made. But when money is consistently used to solve emotional problems, it creates behavioral ones that compound over time in ways that become very difficult to identify and even harder to reverse. Because emotional needs do not have clear endpoints or definitive and permanent resolution points. There is no specific number in a bank account that permanently resolves the lived experience of insecurity. There is no purchase significant enough to fully and durably stabilize an identity that has been built primarily on external validation. There is no lifestyle elevated enough to remove the experience of comparison from someone whose sense of worth depends on the comparison consistently coming out favourably. So the target moves continuously forward regardless of how much progress has been made toward the previous one. And as the target moves, decisions become reactive rather than intentional, driven by the widening gap between where things currently are and where they need to be to finally feel sufficient and settled. This is where intelligent people quietly and consistently underperform relative to what their analytical capabilities would suggest should be entirely possible for them. Not because they lack access to the right information or the right frameworks for thinking carefully about financial decisions, but because they fundamentally overestimate the role that information and frameworks play in a system driven ultimately by behavior rather than knowledge. They know what to do in the abstract, and often with considerable precision and genuine sophistication, but knowledge does not remove discomfort. And discomfort, when it is left unexamined and unacknowledged across extended periods, will always find a way to override the strategy that knowledge carefully produced. It will push towards selling at precisely the moments when patience is what the position structurally requires to deliver its intended outcome. It will push toward buying at precisely the moments when restraint would have preserved the capital needed for a genuinely better opportunity arriving later. It will push toward upgrading the visible markers of a lifestyle at the exact moment when maintaining stability would have created the leverage needed for something considerably more durable and meaningful. And each individual decision in isolation feels small and reasonable and entirely defensible, given the specific circumstances present at the time it was made. But the pattern those decisions form across years and decades is not small, and it is not defensible when examined with any honesty. It is the accumulated record of a psychology managing its own discomfort through financial decisions that were never designed to manage discomfort and are structurally unsuited to do so effectively, because money does not respond to intensity of effort or sophistication of analysis in any direct or reliable way. It responds to consistency of behavior sustained across time and across the full range of emotional conditions that time will inevitably and repeatedly produce. And consistency is not primarily a function of intelligence or the quality of analytical frameworks being applied. It is a function of behavior that can survive the emotional pressure that financial environments reliably and repeatedly generate across every cycle. This is the part of the conversation about money that is rarely examined with the seriousness and honesty it genuinely deserves. The quiet advantage in financial markets does not belong to the person who understands money most deeply, or analyzes it most rigorously, or consumes the most information about it. It belongs to the person whose behavior interferes with the compounding process the least across the longest available period of time. The person who can remain genuinely still when action feels urgent and the entire environment is communicating that something must be done immediately before the opportunity closes. The person who can delay gratification when acceleration feels justified, and the social environment is visibly and loudly rewarding those who are moving faster and accumulating more visibly. The person who can tolerate the psychological weight of not reacting to information that feels significant and urgent but does not actually warrant a portfolio level response when examined with clarity. The person who has developed, through deliberate and sustained attention to their own behavioral patterns under pressure, the capacity to sit with discomfort long enough to recognize whether it is signaling a genuine problem or simply expressing the ordinary anxiety of operating in an environment that is structurally uncertain. Because in most cases, the decision that feels hardest to make in the moment, the one that requires overriding the strongest emotional pressure and the most compelling immediate justification, is precisely the one that interferes the least with the outcome that was already quietly developing. Patience is not a passive or disengaged orientation toward money and markets. It is an active and genuinely demanding discipline that requires continuous and largely invisible effort to maintain against the persistent pressure of an environment structurally designed to reward the opposite behavior. And over time, the difference between the investor who maintains that discipline through real market conditions and the one who cannot becomes visible in ways that are impossible to argue with. Not through a single dramatic breakthrough moment or a single catastrophic and visible failure, but through the quiet and cumulative absence of unnecessary damage across the full length of the investment horizon. The absence of forced decisions made under emotional pressure that the underlying situation did not actually require or warrant. The absence of sound positions exited at the wrong moment because the psychological discomfort of holding them through normal variation became too difficult to sustain without external validation. The absence of capital redirected toward lifestyle acceleration at the exact moments when allowing it to continue compounding, undisturbed, would have produced outcomes that no amount of subsequent correction could fully restore. The absence of emotional corrections quietly reframed as strategic adjustments, which feel from the inside like disciplined and sophisticated portfolio management and function from the outside as its measurable opposite. Intelligent people remain financially constrained, not because they lack the analytical tools to understand what durable wealth requires. They remain constrained because the behavioral infrastructure required to act consistently on that understanding across decades of genuine emotional pressure is difficult to construct and even more difficult to sustain when the pressure is actually present and not merely theoretical. It requires a relationship with discomfort that most high-performing environments never develop in the people they produce and in many cases actively work against. It requires the genuine willingness to appear to be doing very little in professional and social environments that consistently and loudly reward visible, confident, and decisive action. It requires the intellectual humility to recognize that the most persuasive and sophisticated arguments for deviating from a sound, long-term approach are very often generated by the exact psychology the approach was carefully designed to protect against in the first place. So the question is not whether you understand money at the level of sound principles and historically validated approaches to building wealth across time. Most people who engage seriously and honestly with financial thinking reach a reasonable and workable understanding of those principles relatively early in the process. The question is whether your behavior, examined honestly and without flattery across the full range of emotional conditions you actually encounter in real market environments, allows that understanding to compound across the time horizon that compounding genuinely requires to produce its most significant and lasting effects. Because if the behavior does not support the understanding, if the discomfort consistently and reliably overrides the strategy before it has time to work, if the emotional corrections accumulate faster than the compounding can absorb and recover from them, then the problem was never primarily about money or the lack of it. It was about the psychology that money, in its unique and relentless capacity as a mirror for what people fear and need and want to prove about themselves, brought quietly and persistently to the surface every single time a decision was required. And until that psychology is examined with the same rigor and honesty applied to balance sheets and return calculations and financial models, the cycle will continue, quietly, consistently, at compound interest.